What happened to JonBenet Ramsey? The chilling events of December 1996 would send shockwaves across America, leaving behind a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Was it a tragic accident, a brutal crime, or something far darker than anyone could imagine? JonBenet Ramsey, a 6-year-old beauty queen, was found dead in her family's Boulder, Colorado home on the morning after Christmas in 1996. Her name would soon become synonymous with one of the most haunting and mysterious unsolved crimes in modern American history. A bright, blonde little girl with a passion for performing, JonBenet's life was cut tragically short, and an investigation into her death would raise more questions than answers. It all began when JonBenet's mother, Patsy Ramsey, made a desperate 911 call at 5:52 a.m. on December 26. She reported that her daughter had been kidnapped and a ransom note had been left in the house. The family was told that they had to pay $118,000, an oddly specific amount that matched John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus, for JonBenet's safe return. But as the hours passed, the nightmare deepened. By mid-morning, the situation took a chilling turn. Despite the ransom demand, JonBenet was not returned home. Instead, she was found by her father, John, in the family's basement, hidden under a blanket. She had been strangled with a garrote and struck in the head with a blunt object. The small, innocent girl, who spent the night sleeping in her bed, dreaming of Christmas presents, was now the victim of a heinous and mysterious crime. What made this case even more baffling was the scene surrounding JonBenet's death. The ransom note, which had been carefully crafted and left for the family to find, was long and bizarre. More than just a simple demand for money. Written in an almost theatrical tone, the note seemed to be a calculated effort to mislead the police and the public. It wasn't just about the money. It felt personal. The note suggested that the kidnappers were experienced and well prepared. Yet, no trace of the so-called intruders was found. No fingerprints, no blood, no sign of forced entry. At first, the investigation seemed to point to an intruder, someone who had broken into the house, kidnapped JonBenet, and then killed her. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, doubts began to creep in. Could it have been someone closer to JonBenet? Was the kidnapper someone within her own family? And most intriguingly, why was the ransom note so strange, so over the top? These questions quickly became the centerpiece of the investigation. As the police delved deeper into the family's lives, their behavior under suspicion began to raise even more questions. The way JonBenet's parents and her brother, Burke, reacted to police investigations seemed odd. Why did John and Patsy seemingly act so calm for parents whose daughter was missing and in danger? Why did they refuse to cooperate fully with the police in the early days of the investigation? Was there something they were hiding? Was someone in the Ramsey household involved in crime? The case would only grow more puzzling as evidence began to appear, both contradicting the theory of a random intruder and pointing toward a more intimate crime. The handling of the evidence, the lack of a clear suspect, and the growing media frenzy made this case one of the most publicized in true crime history. As the years passed, the theories surrounding JonBenet's death multiplied, each more bizarre than the last, but none offering a definitive answer. Was JonBenet killed by an outsider with a twisted motive? Or did someone inside the family play a role in the tragic events that unfolded? The JonBenet Ramsey case remains an enigma, and despite decades of investigation, it still haunts those who seek answers. Today, we'll dive into the key piece of evidence that has fueled much of the speculation, the infamous ransom note, and explore the many layers of this unsolved mystery that continue to captivate the world's attention. What really happened that Christmas night in Boulder? It was the day after Christmas, 1996, and in the Ramsey household, what should have been a time of joy and celebration quickly turned into a nightmare. JonBenet Ramsey, a 6-year-old girl with a sparkling smile and a love for pageants, had gone to bed the night before with dreams of Christmas gifts and family traditions. But by the morning, the vibrant little girl was nowhere to be found, and a chilling mystery began to unfold. At 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey picked up the phone and made the call that would forever change the lives of her family and the entire nation. "I've got a kidnapping," she told the 911 operator, her voice high-pitched and frantic. The words were spoken in a panic, but they seemed strangely rehearsed, like someone who had been through a traumatic event before. Patsy quickly explained that a ransom note had been found in the house, and her daughter JonBenet was missing. The demand? $118,000, an oddly specific amount, which happened to be close to the exact bonus JonBenet's father, John Ramsey, had received that year. The operator, understandably confused and concerned, asked several follow-up questions. "What is the situation? Where is she? What do you want me to do?" Patsy's answers came in a rush, as though she could barely catch her breath. "We have a ransom note," she repeated. "She's gone. She's gone, please, we need help." But as the 911 dispatcher tried to get more information, it became clear that something wasn't quite right. Patsy's frantic plea was contrasted by her composed, almost practiced demeanor. The dispatcher noted that she seemed overly calm for a mother whose child was missing. Could this be a staged scenario? Or was it simply the shock and terror of a mother in distress? Patsy continued, saying that she found a ransom note in the basement and feared that whoever had taken JonBenet would harm her if the family didn't comply with the instructions. Patsy even mentioned that she had gone upstairs to check on JonBenet before making the call. The phone call ended abruptly as the dispatcher urged her to stay on the line. The next few minutes would prove crucial, but none of them knew that JonBenet's fate had already been sealed long before the police arrived. After hanging up, Patsy rushed to tell John Ramsey what had happened. The two of them, both visibly distraught, frantically searched their home, but it wasn't long before they discovered something far worse than what they could have imagined. JonBenet's body was found in the basement. John, horrified and confused, immediately carried JonBenet upstairs, a small, lifeless body wrapped in a blanket, hidden under a small window near the wine cellar. The discovery was more than they could comprehend. JonBenet wasn't kidnapped. She had been killed. This innocent little girl, the apple of her parents' eyes, was dead, and no ransom demand could bring her back. The police arrived soon after, but by then, much of the crime scene had already been compromised. The family had been inside the house, and the evidence, especially the discovery of JonBenet's body, was not handled in the way a typical investigation would require. No one knew it then, but these first hours would become the foundation for many theories to come, as the investigation was already teetering on shaky ground. Meanwhile, the Ramsey family's reactions continued to raise eyebrows. As the police arrived and began processing the scene, John and Patsy's emotions were erratic. John was reported as being upset but composed, while Patsy appeared deeply emotional, occasionally breaking down in tears, but also seeming to almost detach herself from the situation. Both parents expressed disbelief, but there were moments where the behavior of the Ramsey family seemed strangely inconsistent with the tragedy unfolding around them. The police were also taken aback by the situation. It was clear that JonBenet had been murdered, but there was confusion about what had actually happened. The crime scene wasn't typical. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no apparent struggle. Instead, the house had been left disturbingly normal, except for the ransom note. And there was something about the note, its wording, its tone, its specific demands, that struck investigators as odd. Even though the family was visibly shaken, the circumstances surrounding JonBenet's disappearance and subsequent death began to draw suspicions from both law enforcement and the public. Why was the ransom note so long and bizarre? Why did the parents appear to be oddly calm for people whose daughter had just been found murdered in their own home? In the aftermath, police began to focus on the family, particularly Patsy and John, as they continued to act in ways that seemed at odds with the situation. Patsy, in particular, drew attention for the manner in which she acted in the hours following the discovery. Her ability to maintain composure during the chaos was puzzling, and her inconsistencies, including her reactions to questions, would later fuel suspicions about her role, or lack thereof, in her daughter's death. As the day went on, news outlets began reporting on the tragic event, and the Ramsey family became the focal point of media frenzy that would only escalate as more details of the case emerged. The world now had an unsolved murder on its hands, and JonBenét's face would soon be everywhere, on TV screens and newspapers and in the minds of people everywhere. Yet, despite the massive attention the case received, the questions surrounding JonBenét's death would only grow larger, and the family would remain at the center of a growing storm of speculation. The discovery of JonBenét's body was only the beginning of a much larger, more complicated story. A story that will continue to captivate the world for years to come. The ransom note found in the Ramsey home on the morning of JonBené Ramsey's death is one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case, and also one of the most controversial. Its content and the way it was handled by the family immediately raised suspicions, with many questioning whether it was genuine or part of an elaborate ruse to mislead investigators. To this day, the ransom note remains one of the most scrutinized aspects of this chilling crime. The note was found by Patsy Ramsey on the back staircase of their Boulder, Colorado home, at the very spot where she would later make the fateful 911 call. It was a 3-page letter written on Patsy's notepad, demanding $118,000 for the safe return of JonBené. At first glance, the note's sheer length, peculiar phrasing, and exact dollar amount made it stand out immediately as unusual, but as investigators delved deeper, its inconsistencies and oddities only became more glaring. The amount requested, $118,000, was perhaps the most striking detail of the ransom note. Why $118,000? It wasn't an arbitrary number. It was the exact figure of John Ramsey's recent Christmas bonus. The coincidence was bizarre and raised immediate questions. Why would a kidnapper, who had supposedly abducted a 6-year-old child, specifically request this amount? It didn't feel like the usual, broad demand for tens of thousands of dollars. The specificity was troubling, suggesting a possible inside knowledge about the Ramsey family's financial situation. The note also demanded that the money be delivered in a very specific manner, including instructions for the family to use an intermediary to deliver the money. The instructions were overly detailed, but not in the way one might expect from a seasoned criminal. For instance, the tone of the note was oddly formal and theatrical. Phrases like, "We represent a small foreign faction," and "You will be allowed to bring her back to you," read more like a script than a true ransom note. This language, alongside bizarre mention of a foreign faction, suggested that the writer was more concerned with creating a sense of drama than with securing the return of JonBené. Furthermore, there were peculiarities in the structure of the ransom note that made it seem artificial. The writer had used unusual capitalization throughout the note, including terms like SBTC and victory, and their sentence structure was strangely formal and complex. The way the words were written didn't feel like something that would typically come from a panicked kidnapper. Most kidnappers are in a hurry, anxious to get the money, not composing a lengthy, grammatically peculiar missive. It was almost as though the writer was trying too hard to make the note seem convincing, as though the writer knew someone would scrutinize every word. What further complicated the mystery was the absence of fingerprints on the note. Despite the fact that it was written on paper that was likely handled by the writer, the police found no prints that could link it to a suspect. It was as though the person had taken extra precautions to avoid leaving traces behind, which added to the suspicion that the note might have been fabricated to mislead investigators. In addition to the language and structure, the content of the note itself struck a dissonant chord with investigators. It was over the top in its attempt to appear authentic. The writer claimed to be part of a small foreign faction with military expertise, a claim that seemed far too elaborate for an ordinary ransom note. The tone shifted from formal to strangely emotional, almost theatrical. "Don't try grow a brain, John. You are not the only fat cat around, so don't think that killing will be the way out." The sentence made no sense in the context of an ordinary kidnapping demand. The phrasing was far too personal and dramatic, which gave the note the feel of a theatrical performance rather than a real threat. The emotional manipulation in the note was also striking. The writer repeatedly addressed JonBenét's family directly, trying to impose a sense of guilt on them. The note warned John Ramsey not to grow a brain, and explicitly threatened that the consequences would be dire if he didn't comply. It was clear that the writer was trying to induce fear and desperation in the family, yet the structure of the note felt far too rehearsed for someone who was genuinely in a state of panic. The inconsistencies within the note raised more questions. For one, the writer demanded that the ransom be paid in a way that would involve the Ramseys having to trust strangers, yet at the same time, it was evident that the writer had access to the family's inner circle. The choice to leave a note in such a high-profile place, on the back staircase, easily discoverable, suggested that the writer knew the layout of the house well, and perhaps had been inside before. Additionally, the detail of the ransom note being longer than typical ransom notes and filled with unnecessary flourishes made it seem less like a desperate criminal's plea for money and more like an attempt to confuse and mislead. What also didn't make sense was that, despite the serious tone of the note, there was no immediate proof that JonBenet was alive when the note was discovered. If the family had truly been kidnapped, why hadn't they seen any signs of JonBenet? Why, instead of immediately calling the police, did the family spend hours before JonBenet's body was found, with no sign of urgency to prove her safety? One of the most chilling details was the ransom note's final instructions. The family was to keep quiet about the incident, and interestingly, it implied that JonBenet's fate was already sealed unless they cooperated. The chilling finality of the statement left little room for hope, and many experts believe that this was meant to cast doubt in the family's mind as to whether their daughter was alive or not. Was the person behind the note genuinely seeking money, or was this all part of an elaborate cover-up? In the end, the ransom note seemed designed not just to demand money, but to confuse, intimidate, and misdirect those who would try to solve the case. Its inconsistencies and strange choice of words raised serious doubts about its authenticity, and for many investigators, it only deepened the mystery surrounding JonBenét's tragic death. The ransom note, with its perplexing language and suspicious details, was the first clue that pointed not to a simple kidnapping, but to a far more complex and sinister plot. Was the writer truly an outsider with knowledge of the family's finances and personal life? Or was the note part of a darker story? One that would implicate someone much closer to JonBenet than anyone could imagine? The discovery of JonBenet Ramsey's body in her own home set off an investigation that would quickly evolve into a public spectacle, with the Ramsey family at the center of it all. In the early hours of December 26, 1996, as the police arrived at the Ramsey household, there was a palpable sense of confusion and urgency. What initially appeared to be a tragic kidnapping had rapidly turned into a homicide investigation, and the strange circumstances surrounding JonBenet's death only deepened the mystery. The initial police response was far from ideal. When the police first arrived, they were met with a scene that was anything but typical for a child abduction case. Patsy Ramsey had already made the 911 call, and by the time officers arrived, the crime scene had been compromised. The Ramsey family was inside the house, moving around and even touching objects before police had a chance to properly secure the area. The Ramsey home had not been sealed off, and the family's initial actions would come to be seen as a significant point of concern in the investigation. JonBenet's body was discovered by her father, John Ramsey, who had been the one to find her hidden in the basement. He later claimed that he thought she had been kidnapped at first, but when he found her body, his emotions ranged from disbelief to shock. As he carried her upstairs, her small, lifeless body wrapped in a blanket, the scene became more surreal than real. What struck many in the early stages of the investigation was the behavior of JonBenet's parents. While it's entirely understandable that grief could manifest in different ways, both John and Patsy seemed strangely composed for parents whose daughter had just been found dead under such horrific circumstances. Throughout the initial hours, they appeared to struggle to process the tragedy, while also keeping their cool in a way that struck investigators as unusual. John Ramsey's behavior was especially scrutinized. He was upset but maintained an odd sense of control as he interacted with the police. Though distraught, he appeared to take charge of the situation rather than react in the manner one might expect from a father in such a devastating circumstance. It wasn't just a composure that raised eyebrows. It was his lack of urgency in handling the situation. John did not seem to immediately demand answers or show the typical signs of panic that might have accompanied a parent discovering their child's body in such an unsettling manner. Similarly, Patsy Ramsey's behavior was another focal point for investigators. While she did break down in tears at times, she was also observed to be strangely detached. She would often become emotional, but the intensity of her emotions would fluctuate erratically. At one point, it was noted that Patsy seemed to be in full control of herself, acting in a manner that was more poised than would be expected for a mother in the midst of an unimaginable tragedy. Some even suggested that Patsy's demeanor appeared rehearsed, as though she prepared for this moment in some way, which only fueled further suspicions. The early timeline of events and the family's actions did not help matters either. After JonBenet was found, the police began to question the family, but their stories didn't quite line up. John and Patsy were questioned multiple times over the course of the next few days, and their accounts were inconsistent with the physical evidence at the scene. For instance, when questioned about JonBenet's whereabouts the night before, John and Patsy claimed to have no idea who would have wanted to harm their daughter. Yet at the same time, both seemed to express an almost casual attitude about the investigation, making statements that were at odds with the seriousness of the situation. One of the biggest red flags in the early investigation was a handling of the ransom note. Though the note was central to the case, police were initially cautious about its authenticity. It was too long, too detailed, and its bizarre content seemed out of place for a real abduction. As investigators began to question the family, it became clear that the note's oddly specific dollar amount, $118,000, was the exact figure of John Ramsey's bonus for the year. This discovery led some to believe that the ransom note might not have been written by an outsider at all, but by someone who had intimate knowledge of the Ramsey family's financial affairs. Adding to the confusion, the police had initially suspected a possible intruder had entered the home through a small broken window in the basement, which seemed to be the only plausible point of entry. However, there were no signs of forced entry, something that is usually a telltale sign of an intruder. What's more, the family's behavior after the discovery didn't suggest the usual shock and terror associated with a traumatic event. There were inconsistencies in their statements about what had happened, as well as strange actions that seemed more aligned with someone trying to cover their tracks rather than trying to solve a crime. Furthermore, the family's refusal to cooperate fully with the police investigation added another layer of suspicion. At one point, John and Patsy's attorney was brought in, and their interactions with the police became more cautious and guarded. The police had limited access to the family for questioning, and there was a reluctance to answer questions that seemed like simple steps in an investigation. The refusal to fully cooperate, while not necessarily an admission of guilt, immediately set off alarms for investigators. What also didn't add up was the police's initial handling of the crime scene. When John Ramsey found JonBenet's body in the basement, he moved her without waiting for the police to arrive. In any typical investigation, this would be seen as a critical mistake. Touching or moving the body could have altered important evidence, and yet this action seemed to go largely unchallenged by the police in those crucial early hours. As the days wore on, the inconsistencies in the family's story and behavior grew more pronounced. The tension between the police and the Ramsey family escalated. On the one hand, JonBenet's parents maintained their innocence, pleading with authorities to solve the case. On the other hand, their suspicious behavior and erratic statements began to raise doubts. Was the family hiding something? Or were they simply struggling with the unimaginable grief of losing their daughter? The early investigation was marked by a growing tension between the public's desire for answers and the family's reluctance to fully engage with the police. The question at the heart of it all, who killed JonBenet Ramsey, seemed to have no easy answer. And as the police struggled to piece together the puzzle, more questions about the family's role in the tragedy emerged, leaving the case shrouded in confusion and suspicion. The discovery of JonBenet Ramsey's body in the basement of her family's home on December 26, 1996, marked the beginning of a complex investigation that would be filled with mysteries, contradictions, and troubling inconsistencies. The crime scene, like the ransom note found earlier, raised more questions than answers, leaving investigators scrambling to piece together the truth behind JonBenet's tragic death. The evidence found at the Ramsey home would become central to the case and would continue to haunt both the police and the public for years to come. The location of JonBenét's body was the first major anomaly. Despite the fact that the family had been told that JonBenet was missing and in danger, her body was found relatively easily, hidden under a blanket in a small, dark room in the basement. The basement, a place typically used for storage, seemed an odd place for someone to leave a young child body, and the fact that JonBenet had been hidden under a blanket only added to the eerie nature of the scene. The lack of blood around the body and the absence of a visible struggle indicated that the child's death might have been carefully staged, with her body placed in a location where it could be easily discovered. JonBenét's body showed signs of blunt force trauma and strangulation. The garrote, a homemade instrument made from a piece of rope with a broken paintbrush handle, was wrapped tightly around her neck. The use of such a tool suggested that whoever had killed JonBenet had planned the crime carefully and deliberately. The garrote was tightly wound, and forensic experts later determined that it had caused compression of the neck, which ultimately led to JonBenét's death. This method of killing was chillingly personal and brutal. The garrote, unlike typical weapons such as a gun or knife, required the killer to be in close proximity to the victim. It suggested that the murderer had a significant level of control over JonBenet during the final moments of her life. The presence of the garrote in a case of sexual assault added to the complexity of the crime. Some investigators began to speculate that the crime was more than just a random act of violence. It may have been a result of deep, hidden emotions or an attempt to silence JonBenet for reasons that were still unclear. Another key piece of evidence found in the crime scene was a broken window in the basement. For some, this appeared to be the entry point for a possible intruder. The window, which had been broken from the inside, suggested that someone could have easily accessed the basement and subsequently left through the same window. However, there was no blood or fingerprints found around the window, and there was no sign of forced entry anywhere else in the house. This created a glaring inconsistency. If an intruder had come into a window, why hadn't they left more evidence behind? Further analysis of the basement area revealed more contradictions. There was no sign of a struggle, which would be expected in a case of abduction or forced entry. Instead, the basement appeared undisturbed, almost as if it had been carefully arranged. The lack of visible marks or damage around the broken window also made it seem improbable that an intruder had gained access through this method. In fact, some investigators began to question whether the window had been broken after crime had occurred, possibly staged to give the appearance of forced entry. As police began to examine the crime scene, they discovered other unsettling details. JonBenet's pajamas, which were found neatly arranged on her body, were not in disarray. There were no signs of physical resistance or a struggle. No fingerprints were found at the scene, adding to the mystery surrounding the crime. It seemed as though whoever had committed the murder had taken great care to avoid leaving evidence behind. Despite the extensive search of the house, no DNA, no blood, and no fingerprints were found to directly implicate anyone. Another strange aspect of the crime scene was the lack of a significant defensive wound on JonBenet. Typically, in cases of abduction or assault, one would expect to find marks of struggle or defensive wounds on the victim. However, in JonBenet's case, there were none. This could suggest that she had been rendered unconscious, or perhaps even sedated before being strangled. The fact that she had no signs of resistance, despite her age, left many wondering whether JonBenet knew her killer or had been caught off guard. Meanwhile, the family's behavior in the aftermath continued to raise suspicions. The Ramseys had not immediately contacted the police about JonBenet's disappearance. It wasn't until after Patsy Ramsey found a ransom note that the authorities were alerted. The delay in calling the police was unusual in a case where a child was supposedly kidnapped. Additionally, the lack of visible grief in the family was noted by many investigators. Patsy and John Ramsey's composed behavior struck many as unsettling. While it's possible that shock and disbelief could explain their behavior, it was hard to ignore the fact that they seemed to handle the situation in a manner that was not typical for parents facing the horrifying discovery of their child's murder. What's more, the family had not completely cooperated with police. At one point, the police had asked for permission to search certain areas of the house. The fact that John Ramsey removed JonBenét's body from the basement without waiting for the authorities to arrive was also a point of contention. This action was considered a major mistake, as it compromised any physical evidence that might have been found at the crime scene. The lack of cooperation from the Ramseys and their refusal to be forthcoming with the police raised more questions about the family's involvement or potential knowledge of the crime. It seemed almost as if they were hiding something. Their unwillingness to fully cooperate with the investigation, coupled with the suspiciously composed reactions in the face of their daughter's death, fueled ongoing speculation. Were the Ramseys simply victims of tragedy? Or were they, in some way, complicit in their daughter's untimely death? As the investigation into JonBené Ramsey's death unfolded, it quickly became clear that the case was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. What initially appeared to be a straightforward kidnapping turned into a tangled web of evidence, emotions, and contradictions, leading to a variety of theories about what might have happened that night. Two of the most prominent and debated theories have been the intruder theory and the family involvement theory. Both theories present different scenarios, and each comes with its own set of questions and possible motives. As time passed, the case only grew more mysterious, with new revelations and old suspicions continuing to shape the investigation. The intruder theory was the one most widely circulated in the early days of the investigation. This theory suggested that a random intruder entered the Ramsey home, abducted JonBené, and later killed her. Proponents of this theory pointed to certain pieces of evidence that seemed to support the idea of an outsider being responsible for crime. Perhaps the most prominent piece of evidence cited by those who favored the intruder theory was the broken basement window, which seemed to suggest that someone had entered the house through that point of access. The broken window had been found by the Ramseys in the early hours of the investigation, and it was quickly theorized that the intruder had used this as their entry point. The fact that the window had been broken from the inside led some to believe it was the perfect escape route for the killer. Additionally, there were traces of foreign DNA found on JonBenét's clothing, which some investigators believe pointed to an outsider. However, the DNA found did not match anyone in the Ramsey family, and it was never conclusively linked to a suspect. Supporters of the intruder theory also noted that JonBenét's body was found in a secluded area of the home, hidden in the basement. They suggested that the intruder might have planned to keep JonBené alive, but the situation escalated, leading to her death. The presence of the ransom note, with its elaborate language and specific demands, was also used as evidence in favor of this theory. But even with these pieces of evidence, the intruder theory had its flaws. The lack of forced entry into the house, aside from the basement window, cast doubt on the idea that an outsider had come in. There were no signs of a struggle in the home, and there was no evidence of anyone leaving the house without detection. Moreover, JonBenét's body was found in a place that was easily accessible to anyone within the family. Was this really the hiding place an intruder would choose? These contradictions left many investigators questioning the validity of the intruder theory and wondering whether the true culprit was closer to home. As the investigation progressed, another theory began to gain traction: the family involvement theory. This theory posited that someone within the Ramsey family was responsible for JonBenét's death, focusing suspicion on Patsy and John Ramsey, and at times, Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's older brother. One of the key reasons this theory gained traction was the odd behavior exhibited by the family in the aftermath of JonBenét's disappearance. Both Patsy and John Ramsey seemed unnervingly calm for parents who had just discovered their daughter's lifeless body. Their composed demeanor, combined with their actions, such as relying heavily on attorneys to communicate with police, only heightened suspicions. The ransom note was another piece of evidence pointing to potential family involvement. The note's highly personal nature, along with the exact sum of $118,000, matching John Ramsey's Christmas bonus, suggested intimate knowledge of the family's finances. Could someone inside the home have staged the note to look like an external threat? The theory seemed plausible given JonBenét's body was found in an area easily accessible to the family, and the garrote used was a homemade device, hinting at access to household items. The question of motive is one of the most debated aspects of the family involvement theory. For many, the idea that a parent would harm their own child seems unthinkable. However, there are several possible explanations: accidental tragedy, Some speculate that JonBenét's death could have been a tragic accident, possibly involving Burke, her older brother, with the family panicking and staging the scene to look like a kidnapping. Financial deception. Others suggest a ransom note could have been employed to conceal financial troubles, although the family's relatively secure status makes this less convincing. Underlying family conflict. Perhaps the most chilling theory is that hidden tensions within the household culminated in a violent act. The perfect facade of a wealthy, happy family might have masked deeper issues that exploded tragically that night. Ultimately, both the intruder theory and the family involvement theory leave more questions than answers. The lack of concrete evidence linking either theory to the truth of JonBenét's death keeps the case shrouded in mystery. Each passing year seems to deepen the uncertainty about what truly happened that fateful Christmas night in Boulder. The killer, whether an intruder or someone from within the family, remains elusive, leaving behind a case that refuses to fade from memory. As we reflect on JonBenét's story, the chilling question lingers: who really killed JonBenet Ramsey? The JonBenet Ramsey case, with its numerous twists, contradictions, and dead ends, has captivated public interest for over 2 decades. While early investigations were marred by procedural errors and inconsistent witness testimonies, advancements in DNA evidence and modern forensic technology have provided new insights and opportunities for re-examination. Despite the passage of time, DNA evidence has remained a key tool in the search for the truth, with each new breakthrough offering a glimmer of hope in solving the haunting mystery of JonBenét's death. When JonBenét's body was discovered in the Ramsey home in December 1996, the investigation was immediately thrown into disarray. The lack of clear physical evidence linking any suspects to the crime, coupled with the family's suspicious behavior, created a perfect storm of doubt and confusion. For years, the case seemed to stagnate, with little new evidence or breakthroughs to push the investigation forward. However, in the years following the murder, advancements in forensic technology began to make waves in the world of criminal investigations, and the JonBenet case was no exception. The one piece of evidence that had remained at the center of the investigation was the DNA found on JonBenét's body. Specifically, the foreign DNA that had been identified on her underwear and in her genital area. This discovery, which had been overlooked in the early stages of the investigation, would eventually become the key to reopening the case. The initial DNA testing done in 1997 revealed that the DNA found on JonBenet did not match that of her family members or anyone who had been involved in the investigation at that time. The discovery of this foreign DNA led many to believe that an intruder may have been responsible for the crime, supporting the theory that someone outside the Ramsey household had entered the home and killed JonBenet. However, at the time of the original testing, DNA technology was still in its infancy, and the sample quality was not sufficient to provide definitive answers. As a result, investigators were left with little to go on, and the case eventually grew cold. By the early 2000s, significant strides had been made in forensic DNA analysis. Techniques like touch DNA, which allows scientists to extract DNA from trace evidence, such as a single hair or skin cell, made it possible to reanalyze old evidence with greater precision. In 2008, the Boulder Police Department, in conjunction with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, decided to re-examine the DNA evidence in the Ramsey case using these new, advanced methods. The re-examination of the foreign DNA recovered from JonBenet's clothing yielded new insights. The DNA was now matched to a male individual, who was later determined to be an unknown, unidentified male. However, despite these breakthroughs, the identity of the individual remained a mystery, leaving more questions than answers. What was particularly baffling was that the DNA recovered from JonBenet's body didn't appear to be consistent with a known intruder, or anyone who had been previously considered a suspect. The DNA was eventually sent to a national DNA database in an attempt to identify the individual, but the results came back negative, meaning there was no match to any existing criminal records or profiles. While the discovery of the foreign DNA suggested the involvement of an outsider, it also had an important effect on the Ramsey family. For years, John and Patsy Ramsey had been at the center of the investigation, with police and the public alike scrutinizing their behavior and suspecting them of being involved in JonBenet's death. However, the DNA evidence played a pivotal role in clearing the Ramsey family of direct involvement in the crime. In 2008, the Boulder District Attorney's Office officially cleared the Ramsey family of suspicion, based on the results of the DNA analysis. The DNA found on JonBenét's body did not match any of the Ramseys, and the family's exoneration led to a shift in public perception. While the evidence still pointed to the possibility of an intruder, the idea that the family had been involved in the crime was now largely dismissed. This development brought some measure of closure to the Ramsey family, who had long been vilified by the media and public opinion. However, it did little to move the investigation closer to solving the case. The question remained, if the DNA didn't match the family, then who was responsible for JonBenét's murder? While the DNA evidence did not immediately provide answers, it did open new doors for investigators. The discovery of foreign DNA on JonBenét's body raised the possibility that the killer had left traces behind, either through direct physical contact or through some other means. In the years following the re-examination of the DNA, there have been numerous theories about who the unidentified male might be. Some believe that the DNA could belong to someone in the Ramsey family social circle, perhaps a family friend, acquaintance, or even a business associate who was never properly investigated. Others speculate that the DNA could belong to a random intruder who entered the Ramsey home on the night of JonBenét's death. One theory that has gained traction in recent years involves the possibility of a pedophile ring operating in the area at the time, with some theorizing that JonBenét's death could have been part of a larger, more disturbing pattern of child exploitation. However, no conclusive evidence has emerged to support this theory. Despite the absence of definitive answers, modern forensic technology has allowed investigators to analyze the case with a level of precision that was not possible at the time of the original investigation. The advancements in DNA testing, including the use of touch DNA and other cutting-edge techniques, have enabled law enforcement to revisit the evidence and generate new leads. Even as the case remains unsolved, DNA analysis has provided invaluable insights into the nature of the crime and the possible identity of the perpetrator. While the foreign DNA recovered from JonBenét's body does not conclusively identify the killer, it has helped to eliminate the family as suspects and has provided a crucial piece of the puzzle. As forensic technology continues to advance, there may yet be new breakthroughs that will allow investigators to identify the man whose DNA was found on JonBenét's body. Until that day comes, the case remains open, with the hope that modern science may one day bring justice for JonBené Ramsey and the family who have endured so much. The question of who killed JonBené Ramsey remains unanswered, but DNA evidence and modern forensics continue to offer new avenues for discovery and resolution. The murder of JonBené Ramsey is a case that has haunted the public imagination for over 2 decades. The shocking death of a 6-year-old girl, found in her own home, sparked a media frenzy and a police investigation that remains one of the most perplexing and scrutinized in modern history. Despite countless hours of investigation, new forensic technology, and widespread media coverage, the questions surrounding JonBenét's death remain unanswered, leaving both the public and investigators searching for closure. The timeline of events is well documented. On the morning of December 26, 1996, JonBené was reported missing by her mother, Patsy Ramsey, who claimed to have found a ransom note demanding $118,000 for her safe return. What followed was a frantic search that led to the discovery of JonBenét's body in the basement of the Ramsey family home, only hours after the ransom note was found. The cause of death was blunt force trauma and strangulation, with a homemade garrote found wrapped around her neck. The discovery was shocking, and what followed was a mix of conflicting evidence, bizarre theories, and compelling but incomplete evidence. Central to the mystery was the ransom note, which seemed far too elaborate for a typical kidnapper. The odd language, the specificity of the amount demanded, and the way it was phrased all seemed to suggest that the writer had intimate knowledge of the family. Yet, despite this, no one has been able to definitively identify the person responsible for writing it. Was it a family member trying to stage a kidnapping gone wrong? Or was it the work of an intruder, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the situation? This question has continued to fuel speculation for years. Adding to the confusion was the lack of evidence pointing to an outsider. Despite the initial focus on intruder, the broken window in the basement and the foreign DNA found on JonBenét's clothing led investigators to reconsider the possibility of a random attacker. However, the absence of forced entry, the lack of a struggle, and the fact that JonBenét's body was found in a place accessible to family only deepened the mystery. Was it truly the work of an intruder, or was the killer someone inside the Ramsey home? As the investigation dragged on, a variety of theories emerged, each one as unsettling as the last. The theory that a family member may have been involved was particularly troubling. Patsy and John Ramsey were at the center of the investigation for years, and their behavior, especially in the hours following JonBenét's death, raised suspicions. Were their actions a result of shock and grief, or was there something more sinister at play? Theories about accidental death and subsequent cover-up, or even buried family secrets, have swirled around the case, leaving the public divided on whether the Ramseys were victims or active participants in the tragedy. Despite the DNA evidence that was found on JonBenét's body, which did not match any family member, the true identity of the killer remains unknown. Could the DNA belong to a previously unknown intruder? Or does it point to someone connected to the family? Someone who is yet to be identified? The fact that the foreign DNA remains unlinked to anyone in the national database leaves the case open-ended, providing both hope and frustration for those seeking justice. So, where does the case stand now? The Boulder Police Department continues to investigate, but there have been no new developments in recent years. The Ramseys, once at the heart of suspicion, have been cleared of wrongdoing, but many still wonder if they were hiding something. As time passes, the evidence grows colder, and the chance for resolution seems to slip further away. The case of JonBené Ramsey is a haunting reminder that some questions may never be answered. Who killed JonBené Ramsey? Was it a family member acting out of anger, jealousy, or fear? Or was it a random stranger who targeted a young child in her own home? What was the true motive behind such a brutal and senseless crime? These are the questions that still linger unsolved after all these years. As we reflect on the tragedy and the unanswered questions, we must ask, will the truth ever come to light? Or will JonBenét's death remain an unsolved mystery, forever leaving us to wonder about the secrets buried within the walls of the Ramsey home?